All right, what is up, YouTube and Instagram? Looks like we're good on both accounts. Hope you guys are doing well this morning. Feels pretty good outside, so if you get the chance, maybe go outside, spend some time out there today, go on a walk or something of that sort. Got some news yesterday from the governor that it looks like some things are going to slowly start opening up for us, which is maybe good news for some of us, and maybe parents getting to go back to work, or we're excited to just be able to get out of the house and do some things maybe this weekend. This morning, we're going to be on the back half of John chapter 12. So we looked at the first half of chapter 12 yesterday, and we're in the midst of that moment where Jesus rides a donkey into the city, and people are laying down palm branches and they're worshiping him, and they're kind of summoning him in as king. And so we're actually still going to be in that moment today. We're just in the back half of chapter 12, which actually deals with a little bit more of what Jesus says and some of his words and interactions. And so you'll notice there's a lot more. If you've got like a New Testament that has red letters in it for Jesus's words, you're going to see a lot more red lettering throughout that. They're going to talk a little bit about prophecy and things of that sort. And so we're coming very, 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 very quickly into the crucifixion. So we're in kind of that week of mindset, and we're actually looking at the last moment where Jesus is in front of the crowd before he's on trial again. So everything after this is Jesus with his disciples or in the garden. They're very personal moments. You're going to see moments where they're just Jesus and prayer and things like that. So this is his last moment with the crowd and some of the things that he's going to say, which is important, right? We talk about at the Loft, we talk about in growth groups and things like that a lot of times, that whatever Jesus is saying towards the back end of something or in his last moments, they're probably really important, because that's going to be the thing that he really wants people to hear and to understand. And so if you're there, you can go into chapter 12, you can look in verse 20, and we see this moment that some Greeks walk up. Now, there's something important to know, like some historical context to know really as you're reading scripture, really the New Testament as a whole. You're going to see a lot of distinction between groups of people that are maybe Jews and Gentiles is one distinction. Greeks is going to kind of be that distinction that happens a lot of times, especially during the life of Jesus. And so in the Jews and Gentiles conversation, all that means is people of the Jewish faith and tradition, and not just faith, but nationality and things like that. And Gentiles is pretty much everybody in the rest of the world. So you and I, we would be Gentiles in those moments. The same thing is kind of playing out in this moment where it specifies that some Greeks walked up. What it's trying to say is that Jesus's ministry and kind of fame and status is now becoming well known, not just in Jerusalem and Judea and Israel and throughout the Jewish people. It's being like expanded into the known world, and people from outside of the Jewish faith are taking interest in Jesus. And so this is kind of a huge moment in the midst of that. And that's why it specifies that. The moment that we read, we're going to read a little bit at a time and kind of talk through it. But it starts in verse 20, and it says, "Now some Greeks were among those who went up to worship at the festival." So they're there when Jesus walks in. "And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and requested of him, 'Sir, we want to see Jesus.' So Philip went and told Andrew, and then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus." Now, they go and tell Jesus. The way that Jesus answers them is interesting, because he doesn't really entertain the fact of like, oh yeah, let me talk to them. What he says in verse 23 is this: "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The one who loves his life will lose it, and the one who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. Where I am, there my servant also will be. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now my soul is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But that is why I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven: "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd standing there heard it and said it was thunder. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus responded, "This voice came not for me, but for you. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. As for me, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." He said this to indicate what kind of death he was about to die. We're going to stop there for a moment, because the way that Jesus answers this, these Greeks coming up and asking to meet him, is he then begins to tell a story about a seed falling into the ground and something dying, but life coming from that death. And it's this interesting moment when we begin to answer some of our questions of who is present. So we've got a couple disciples present. We're actually in the midst of a large crowd. So in the very least, they're hearing part of this conversation. They're entertaining part of this conversation. And then we've got Jesus present, and we've got these Greeks present. So Jesus says the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, which is an important thing, right? Because if you've been with us in this John study, or if you've spent any time in John, Jesus continually says the time has not come. He's escaped a couple different stonings and a couple different dangers because the time has not yet come. And now we're transitioning because Jesus says the time has come. He's beginning to prepare himself mentally and emotionally and spiritually for the crucifixion, and he's beginning to point to it. And then he talks about a grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying, which is weird, but what he's trying to point to is that when fruit or vegetable or plant, when it dies, it drops seed, and now it feels like a waste. It feels like this weird thing that, oh, this wheat has died. We can't use it to make bread. We can't use it to produce certain things. But what happens is that a seed is planted and more grows. And so what seems like a waste is actually productive for moving forward. It actually creates fruit and creates life. And so Jesus uses this analogy to begin to point toward his crucifixion. Right, that as we're reading this today, we can easily make the jump of, oh man, Jesus is talking about his own death. And so Jesus begins to talk about his own death to the crowd. That's why he transitions to talk about the one who follows him and what it looks like to follow him. This is a great passage as Jesus transitioned for us to look and go, what does this passage say about people? What does this passage say for Christians? What does he want for Christians? For you to take some time to highlight and to underline and say, what does it mean for the one who loves his life will lose it, and the one who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life? If anyone serves me, he must follow me. Where I am, there my servant will also be. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Jesus makes some straightforward statements that you and I can look at and begin to go, what does this mean for my life individually? Something that I can't answer for you, but what does it mean for you to lose your life for the sake of following Jesus, to give up the things that you would define your life by for the sake of following Jesus and doing the things that he would ask of you? What does it look like to be where Jesus is? Because he said that's what his servant and his followers do. So this is one of those passages that we can begin to navigate that, but then something really cool happens. God speaks to Jesus through thunder. And so we see this moment where there's a conversation between Jesus Christ and God the Father, and thunder is present. Everyone hears it. They make note of it. They comment on it. So we see and know that it happens. John writes it down. And then Jesus says, hey, this wasn't for me. This was for you, that you will see this interaction between me and the Father, which Jesus talks about regularly. That anytime that he begins to talk to the Father audibly and things like that, especially in front of crowds, he talks about how, hey, that's not for me, that's for you, so you can see my connection to the Father, which is what he's pointing to in this moment as well. And then he again points to this being lifted up from the earth. And so he's always talking about how he's going to die. And he's talked about this a couple times. I think it was with the woman at the well where he talked about how he was going to be lifted up, and that's where the forgiveness of man would come from and things like that. He compared it to the snake in Exodus. If you go back in some of our sections, it was either, I can't remember if it was the woman at the well or somebody else, but Jesus has that interaction in that conversation with a couple people. So he says this to talk about how he will die. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because remember, the crowd is summoning him in as king. They're calling him Messiah. They have a knowledge of who the Messiah, or what the Messiah will be, what they will look like, the things that they will do, because they have some prophecy, which we're going to get to in a little bit. And so they get a little bit confused, because when he talks about being lifted up, they begin to think of the cross in the known world, a very known way of being executed or put to death. And so the crowd replied to him, we have heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? And so they go, well, if the Messiah is supposed to be forever and reign forever, are they different from the Son of Man? Who's supposed to be lifted up? We're confused at this transition. And so we've seen over and over again this confusion of who Jesus is. And what he will do and what it will appear to be. And Jesus walks back in and answers in verse 35, the light will be with you only a little longer. He's referring to himself. Walk while you have the light so that darkness doesn't overtake you. The one who walks in darkness doesn't know where he's going. While you have the light, believe in the light so that you may become children of light. Again, this is some pretty straightforward parts in the text, some analogies that maybe we're familiar with, where there's a lot of drawing and contrast of light and the dark, and what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to walk in the light and not the dark, and to be children of light. These are some straightforward points, but this is a moment that we can again stop and pause and ask ourselves, man, how are we children of light? Sometimes we go, man, we're children of light because we're sons and daughters of God, and which is true if we've put our faith in Jesus. But Jesus takes it a step further. He says to believe in the light, not just believe that it was real, but to have some of that actionable faith that we talk about at the Loft. So Jesus says this, and then he goes ahead of the group. He said this thing. And then in verse 37, we actually get to see some prophecies that are going to be fulfilled, that one of the ways that we know that Jesus is the Christ is because of prophecy. So it's going to quote from the book of Isaiah, where you can go back and see these things that are true, that were said hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus, and how he begins to fulfill them. And it says, even though he had performed so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, who said, Lord, who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? This is why they were unable to believe, because Isaiah also said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, so that they would not see with their eyes or understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke about him. Nevertheless, many did believe in him, even among the rulers. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, so that they would not be banned from the synagogue. For they loved human praise more than praise from God. There's this moment where Jesus has done all these signs. He's done 7 that we've read through in John, but John actually goes on to say later that there were many more that John didn't record. And so we don't even have a number of how many signs and miracles and things that Jesus did to point to who he was. John picked the most important and wrote about them. And in the midst of that, we see that even in this, even as this crowd has just welcomed him and his king, they're having trouble believing. Not that he's done cool things or things like that, but of who Jesus really is, that he's the Son of God, which is important. They can't just believe that he's going to be a war hero, which is a little bit of what they think. They can't just believe he's going to overthrow the government. They can't just believe that he's a good guy. They have to believe that Jesus is the King. He's the Son of God. And so they will quote some prophecy in Isaiah that many will see the signs and will not believe. And that's for all of this group of people. Now, John does say that there are groups of people who saw the signs and believed. There were kind of this small minority. But then he says, but even those people, they had trouble actually doing anything with that because they loved the praise of man more than they loved God and praise from God. And so this is one of those moments where we can stop. And when we ask our question, oh man, who is present? We have kind of Isaiah present through his old text. We see them reference and talk about the Pharisees and the religious rulers are really the people that this passage is talking about in this little moment where John takes a pause. And so the Pharisees and the religious rulers are probably the people that we could stop and go, do we relate to these people in any way? And, you know, do we look like them in any way? Have we done anything? And so for us as believers, and we go, okay, in this moment, are we anything like the religious rulers and the Pharisees? Well, what does it say that they were like? It says that some of them believed, but didn't do anything with it, that they did not actually confess Jesus because they were afraid of what would happen and they wanted praise from man instead of praise from God. And so for us, is there anything in us that says, hey, I believe in God, but I have trouble confessing it? What that means is I have trouble talking about it. I have trouble being public about it. I have trouble sharing about it. And if so, that means that we are like the Pharisees, because it actually means that we love the praise of man more than the praise of God. Now we can cover it up with kind of these moments where we say, no, I'm just not comfortable, or I'm just shy, or my relationship with Jesus is just very personal. But in these moments in the text, what they see is that there is this confession of Jesus, this public confession, this, confession amongst friends, this vocal mentality that goes along with following Jesus and confessing him in those moments. And so we want to be able to see, hey, is that me? Because we don't want to be like the Pharisees and the religious rulers. We want to take a stand. We want to be public in our faith. It's one of those things that we talk about a lot in baptism, and that we're afraid of what people will think of us or things like that. But we need to always pause in this moment. That John doesn't really, he's not mean, but he doesn't speak kindly on the fact that, hey, there are people that believed, but they were afraid. And they didn't speak up, and they didn't go on to follow Jesus and to be there. And so these are the people that are going to stand idly by as Jesus is crucified. And so we need to be aware of that. And that's a moment that we can pause and deduct that from, hey, who is present? What is going on? Where do I fit into the story? And then we get back into the text, in this whole 44 through 52 passage. This is what Jesus says, and the subtitle's cool because it says it's a summary of Jesus' mission. So if we want to know what Jesus is about in the New Testament, we can read it right here. And it says, the one who believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And the one who sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world so that everyone who believes in me would not remain in darkness. And if anyone hears my words and doesn't keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. And the one who rejects me and doesn't receive my sayings has this as his judge. The word I have spoken will judge him on the last day. For I have not spoken on my own, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a command to say everything I have said. I know that his command is eternal life. So the things that I speak just as the Father has told me. Now remember, this is a group of people that Jesus is talking to, and Jewish people that believe in God the Father historically, traditionally, religiously. They would identify themselves as the people of God. And so a lot of Jesus' mission is talking about that he is God in the flesh. He's the revelation of God. Him and the Father are one, is almost everything that Jesus is trying to communicate, because we have to admit that in order to give our lives over to Jesus, in order to understand that he brings us into a relationship with God and that he's able to do that. And so that's what Jesus focuses on in this mission. This is a moment in this passage that we can ask these questions. What does this say about Jesus? And what does this say about me and my relationship to God, my faith and things like that? And so Jesus says a lot about himself here, but really all what he's getting at over and over again in multiple different ways. And so you can read it and highlight it and circle it and pray over it and think about it. But all he's saying is that him and the Father are one, and that everything he says is from the Father. And so we can either believe and confess that he and the Father are one and believe what he says and act on it, or we can choose to not believe that and to not act on it, in which he says, then that word will speak judgment over you, and it will keep you in eternity apart from God. And so Jesus, super, super clear in some of these things where he's like, this is the point where he's not hinting at it anymore. He's not, just doing signs. He is vocally saying in front of the crowd his last statements. Hey, everything I have said is from the Father because I am from the Father. And believing in me is not just believing in me, it is believing in the Father with which you will have relationship with. And so this is kind of his last moment, his last, hey, choose to believe this. And so today, if you were going to even camp out somewhere, you might spend some time on 44 to 52 and just read it over and over again, and maybe even write down, man, what does this mean about Jesus? What do I believe about Jesus? What does this mean about my faith? And let that kind of sit in your mind and your heart. Come back to it again tomorrow or whatever it is. Because after this moment, we're transitioning to this place where now Jesus is spending time with his disciples. He's in the garden. These are very intimate moments and things that he has to say to his friends. And we are quickly moving to the crucifixion in those moments. So Thursday, you'll hear Tyler teaching on what it looks like when Jesus washes Jesus' feet, the meaning of the foot washing and all that kind of stuff, and what Jesus wants to do there. And so we're going to look at some pretty popular moments in the death and resurrection of Jesus as we move forward. But we've kind of crossed over that first half of John, where we're seeing Jesus' public ministry and signs and things of that sort. And now we're going to move into the death and resurrection and all those encounters, which is on the back half. So really cool stuff. Hope that you got something out of that today to be able to look at John chapter 12. Again, I think a great place to camp out is 44 through 52, where we see what is it that Jesus wanted to accomplish. Because now we can read everything that Jesus does in light of that in the book of John in that little passage. But love you guys. Remember, tomorrow night, The Loft, 6 o'clock here on YouTube or at the link in the Instagram bio. And then your small group will be at 6:30. Your small group leaders love you and they miss you. They can't wait to see you and hang out with you some via video. And hopefully we'll be together in some sort very, very soon. Y'all guys have a great week and stay safe.